Delta CX, available for CX and UX consulting, projects, and training. Contact us for a free consultation.
Hi everybody, we're live. I don't know what day it is. It's Monday, August 3rd, 2020. I hope everybody's well. This is your good friend, Debbie Lovett from Delta CX. Hello, all of you low ego action heroes. Our air conditioning is still semi-broken, so I hope you don't mind the fan. I can't green screen it out. So I hope everybody's staying cool or warm, depending upon where you live relative to the equator. Today we're going to be talking about empathetic or empathic design pros and cons. But of course, first I want to remind everybody to please subscribe to the YouTube channel. YouTube is such a better place to catch these live streams than LinkedIn. For some reason, LinkedIn is like 3 minutes behind. YouTube's about 20 seconds behind. It's more of a community feeling and conversation, and I think we all prefer that. So I hope you'll join me on YouTube. I've got about 700 subscribers. I know these are not exactly YouTuber numbers, but I'm proud of it, and I'm excited that each of you have joined in. We are, of course, live today, and I've got the chat room open, so if there are any questions or comments, or if you just want to say hi and tell us how you're doing, I'm open to that. But I'm also going to be bringing in our guest for today so that he can introduce himself, and we can get started talking about the role of empathy in CX and UX work. So welcome, David Snodgrass, who I'm going to spell for those of you listening to the audio-only version. David, of course, is usually D-A-V-I-D, and Snodgrass is S as in Sierra, N as in Nancy, O-D like Delta, G-R-A-S-S. And over to you, David. Tell us about you. Please introduce yourself.
So, thanks, Debbie. I've been doing UX for a very long time. I kind of stumbled into it when I launched a digital marketing agency way back in 2000, and clients needed websites. So before they could do digital marketing. So we started building out websites, and my original degree is in marketing, and I had a background in direct marketing. So it's a lot about testing. So we brought that mentality into the digital marketing / web development agency, and most of what we did was web design and development. We brought that testing mentality, and it started out, just testing creative against each other to see which version resonated better, and then it got all the way down into testing patterns and navigation structures, and sort of backed into UX in an interesting way. I read a couple of books, but didn't really get deep into the specifics of the discipline that was being developed, kind of in parallel to what we were developing, until a few years later, a few years into that ride. Just continued to do it, right? Just continue to apply what I've learned at every stop, regardless of what they were asking me to do. So if they were bringing me in to help them figure out how to save a project that was failing, and it was a technology project, we were bringing in UX at that same time, right? So it was really sort of a kind of a foundational offering of everything that I was doing through the past however many years I've been doing it, probably way more than I'd care to admit. So that's kind of me. I've worked all over the place. I've worked for B2C, SaaS, e-com, retail, kind of done the gambit of industries, and I find that as you know, that what we do is highly transferable, whether you're working on an internal employee application or something that's going out to millions of people.
Fantastic. And you and I have spoken before, but I hope everybody will be checking you out, following you on LinkedIn. So today's topic was about we keep hearing about how we have to put empathy into our design, and designers need to have more empathy. So I wanted to just get it quickly out of the way and just remind people that there are a lot of different definitions of empathy right now. And so I'm just going to throw a few out there. We don't have to debate it, but just to let people know there are a couple of different angles on empathy right now. I am on the Merriam-Webster website, just looking up the dictionary definition of empathy, and they say the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another, of either the past or present, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated. Okay, so that was really twisty-turny, but what it kind of boils down to is in one they've kind of put in cognitive empathy, which is understanding someone, thinking about them, removing your biases, having no ego, and truly seeing their world through their eyes. And then also what we call emotional empathy, which is, ooh, I am having your feelings. I am so sensitive to and in tune with you. I am having your feelings, which gets a little woo-woo for people. And just quickly, the American Psychological Association frames it similarly. Understanding a person from his or her frame of reference rather than one's own, or vicariously experiencing that person's feeling, perceptions, and thoughts. Empathy does not, of itself, entail motivation to be of assistance. It could turn into sympathy, which may result in action. So a couple of definitions there. We're not going to be battling definitions. Is there a definition you prefer?
No, not really. I mean, all of those sort of go there. I mean, I think what I come down to is that folks are trying to use empathy as a substitute, well, not as a substitute, but they're trying to use the understanding the user in a context, the user's needs and wants in a context. And they're really trying to make that be the word empathy, which I don't think is really really accurate. And I think too, when you, and we're going to talk about kind of the pros and cons, but when I think about that definition, empathy sounds really broad to me, and I think that it's important to understand that what users feel and think exists within a context, right? It's responsive to the context that they're in. I go back to the a grocery app, right? So you're using a grocery store app, and if you're using it at home on your couch, that's a very different kind of experience than if I'm using it in the store to check off or find what I'm looking for. When I'm home on my couch, I usually have both hands, right? So it's a two-fingered experience, right? When I'm in the store, I'm usually only be able to use my thumb because I've usually got something else going on with my other hand. If I had a kid with me, right, my context is further limited because my attention span now has been zoop. I gotta pay attention to multiple objects. So you can't you can't be generally empathetic in that way and get to specifics, right? So I think that's part of when we talk about that definition and where I get wary with that word empathy. Again, I'm never going to discourage somebody trying to use research or do research that's going to lead them to a greater understanding of their user, even if the team's involved with that. Never going to shoot that down, right? Disclaim that right now, because I know this empathy is a real hot word. And, if somebody's out there trying to get fueled up for the journey, right, they're burnt out and they're trying to figure out how do we reinvest with the user, and they're going out and they're observing or they're immersing or whatever, or going undercover, whatever that is. Never going to discourage that, right? Just right. General disclaimer. A lot of people try to throw that out and say, well, this is what well, that's fine. That's great. But that's not necessarily building directly into what you're designing, right? You still have to understand the user's wants and needs in a context. And I think that's really important.
And another disclaimer is my opinions are mine and your opinions are yours and may not reflect any company or client you are working with at this time or in the future.
This is the yes, exactly. Yeah.
We tend to say that for people who I bring on who've got jobs.
Yes, right. And I have, thankfully, I have a gig right now. So yeah, try to just disclaim this is all me and my opinions, doesn't represent anybody else but myself. And then the other disclaimer is I use users, customers, and people interchangeably. I have tried to update because these projects that I've worked on, I'll talk about different things, and we've used these words specifically, like a user or a customer or an associate. We've used them specifically in specific contexts, and it's really hard to disembed those from those experiences, right? They become part of the language of that project, and it's really hard to unwind. So I'm going to use them interchangeably. Debbie, if you feel like I'm being vague,
I use them interchangeably. Don't worry about it.
So what do you mean?
Yeah, and another thing that I want to start out by saying is very often I'll see articles or hear things that say, oh, if we can just create empathy from our stakeholders or coworkers, then I guess magic happens. But I always try to point out that, number one, it's nearly impossible to create empathy in others, and number two, if this were all the magic that we needed when we went to a stakeholder and said, you know, we can show that customers, users are having a problem with this. Can we get the budget to fix it? Someone would go, oh, I am just filled with such empathy for what your customers are going through. Oh my God, here's time and budget. Please fix it. But of course, that doesn't happen. So
Well,
empathy is not the magic bullet.
yeah, well, and that's that again. It's almost an extension of that definition of empathy, right? We're saying we can not only can we build empathy, we can convey it. So we can actually transmit empathy from ourselves that we've gained, which is difficult, right, to someone else, right? And I've never seen that happen before. I've seen stakeholders watch user videos of users using the tool and understand why that's happened before. Is that really empathy, or is that just responding to, oh, this is bad and we need to fix that for our users, right? Yeah. Is empathy the magic bullet? So, can we build empathy? I ask, empathy's great, and it could be fuel for people to, it looks like Debbie froze, so I'm going to keep going with a little bit of further depth here if I can. I think do we need to, right? That's the real question. And I think Don Norman just recently put out an article that I thought was really interesting. We can't get into the heads and minds of millions of people, and moreover, we don't have to. We simply have to understand what people are trying to do and then make it possible. We should not fool ourselves into thinking we can get into their heads. And I think that's really a really poignant kind of point there, right? That he's put out, that we don't have to get in their heads. We just need to understand their wants and needs, right? And I think that's really a key part of it. And I think when we looked at all those definitions, one of the things that I was really interested in is almost all of them include the word understanding. So one of the things that I look at as well is empathy. Is it sympathy, or is it just understanding that we should be chasing? And to me, empathy is a byproduct of building a solid understanding of your users' wants and needs. But it's not always something that we want to focus on, and we'll go over that in the cons later. I think on the pros side, empathy can be a great motivator. It can be great fuel to get a taste of what the user is going through. There's a number of different stories that we could go to, and I think when we talk about like single parenthood, right, is something where single parents have some common experiences that they can generate empathy from, but some of their experiences, depending on their income, depending on whether it's which partner, whether it's a man or a woman, may have some bearing on that experience that I have, and therefore the empathy that I can draw from it. So again, it's that I call it undercover versus observation, and undercover research method has some limitations, right? Like, you're really limited to your own perspective. Now you may get exposed to other perspectives along that journey, and that can be valuable as well. But really immersing yourself in there really does limit your perspective to just your own, right? Which isn't necessarily a great place for user research to happen, depending on what you're trying to discover, right? And I think that's, again, everyone says UX it depends, but it does depend, right? What am I trying to get at? What am I trying to do? So using an undercover research methodology could be very helpful, or it may not be helpful at all, depending on what you're trying to learn. Poverty is another one. Poverty looks very different depending on who you are and where you are. So I think that's a key element as well, right? Just because you experience poverty, it doesn't mean that you have complete empathy or completely can understand everything else someone has gone through. So even if you're doing research, can you really understand their feelings? Can you get really inside their heads? No, I don't think you can. I think you're building a solid understanding, but I think if you're trying to stretch that into empathy, I think you're stretching too far. So it looks like Debbie's having some serious technical issues here. It looks like she has voice but no video, so I'm going to keep going and see if she can get back in here. I think, oh, there's Debbie kind of echoing in the background.
Yes, I'm just shouting into my laptop right now, hoping that will save us. Let's see. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, well, it looks like my video died. I apologize to everybody, but hopefully you can hear me. Little echo.
I can hear you.
Okay, well then the whole world can. So thank you for carrying that while I was having these technical problems, and I have to troubleshoot those. So, where were we? Because I was dealing with technical problems.
Yeah, I just sort of started to talk a little bit through, really, do you need to build empathy? Is that something that you should chase, right? More so than, is it possible? Is it desirable, right? And just sort of walk through, Don Norman's quote and some of those thought processes, and really just outlining that empathy is a byproduct, right, of this understanding. And we'll talk about the cons of that later. And then just walk through kind of like single parenthood, poverty as examples.
Yeah, and I was writing to you earlier about how there was a guy whose podcast I was on, and he was trying to say that maybe if he lived as a homeless person for a week, then he would be sensitive to homeless people and maybe have more empathy for them. And I just thought that that would make him possibly more knowledgeable about one person's experience, but it really wouldn't tell him about homeless people in general because he only had one specific experience for 1 week. So I think we have to think about when observational studies and interviews can tell us more. I think you had an opinion on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, the undercover research methodology does have its limits, right? It has the limits of my perspective. I can only get it from my perspective. I might be exposed to other perspectives, but I'm not really going to have that full perspective of every single person there. And therefore, I'm not going to be able to resonate with all their experiences. There certainly will be common experiences. And if that's what you're trying to discover, undercover research can be a great way to do that, right? If there are certain stumbling blocks that you believe that everyone faces, or you don't know that they're out there, but you would like to discover them, that could be a first step in the research, right? You could go out and discover that. Is that the best way to do it? I don't know. Really, it would depend on the problem, right? Homelessness, becoming immersed would make you pretty knowledgeable about some of those kind of first barriers, right? But you would have, but that to be that be your only research would be a real high risk proposition, right? You have a real high risk of launching the wrong thing that's not really going to help the audience that you're trying to help, right? And I know Debbie and I have talked about this kind of before, but really, what we do is mitigate the risk of launching the wrong thing, right? So as we go through, yeah, you can do kind of not solid research methods, but you have to accept that risk. So again, if this was somebody's kind of side project and they had high hopes for it, and they went out and did this kind of immersive experience where they went undercover, I don't know that would get them all the answers that they're seeking, but it could get them that first layer of situations that they're coming through. But to your point, Debbie, there might be a whole other set of barriers that someone that's not me might face before they even get to those barriers. So again, research methods have to match the objective, right, that you're trying to get to, and that's a really kind of fine-grained, nuanced judgment. Did we lose you again?
Oh, do you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm having quite some amazing adventures here. Sorry to the audience. So,
So what, sometimes I hear from people, well, maybe we won't have empathy, but what about sympathy? Should we really be trying to keep, or someone will say, what about compassion? We need to be doing compassionate work in our UX adventures. Do you think there's any of these, what's the place for any of these?
I mean, again, I think those are fuel, right? Those could be used for fuel for people's motivation, right, on a day-to-day basis. Like, why do you get up and do it, right? You have sympathy for these users, you have compassion for those users, but I think, and we'll kind of go through this, as we get into cons, but um, I think empathy, sympathy, compassion can bias you. They can lead you down the wrong path sometimes if you're not careful, right? You really have to have that objectiveness and critical thinking to get to the root problem and solve it, right? Or do the best that you can within the technology constraints that you have, right? So I think that's really what it's about foundationally. And again, I'm not against empathy, sympathy, or compassion. Those are great things to have. I just don't know that they're required to do design. I just don't know that they're things that I don't believe that you need to deeply connect emotionally with your user base in order to deliver what they want or need. Certainly, you should include those ideas, those things as part of your observation and interview process to see how they respond to it and include that, right? But I'm not sure that it requires me to personally, deeply get really try to get into someone's head. I don't think that's really something that we can do, and I think it crosses that line of individual one user versus a lot of users, right? We tend to design for one user, but really we're designing for a lot of users, right? And it gets back to that: are we over personifying a persona, right? Really, in a way, right? If we go down this empathy path, because again, people's experiences are really broad, and so unless it's a really broad brush stroke that you're shooting for, I don't know that you can serve all users, serve the greatest number of users with a really kind of empathic driven design thought process.
Yeah, and there's also, I don't know if you covered this already, but it's just not a substitute for anything. And we see this a little bit in design thinking, where
Yeah,
someone will say in design thinking, step one, have empathy or create empathy. And now there's a whole bunch of people in the room with sticky notes, or they're guessing at a customer journey map, and they're saying, well, I thought about the customer, so I had empathy, so I
yeah.
must be doing the right thing.
Well, I think it gives you a false sense of security. It can. I'm not going to say it does. I shouldn't say that way. It can give you a false sense of security. Your product team really manages that risk to value, right? How do we capture the value with the appropriate amount of risk? And UX mitigates that risk, right? So we go out and we do research to mitigate the risk of launching the wrong thing. That's the best we can ever do. We use a scientific method. The best it can ever tell you is you're not wrong. That's just the truth. And even if you did the statistically significant work at that level, by the time you completed it, you could have to start all over because it could be wrong by then, right? Because that's the cycle of how fast things change in our world. When you're weighing risk, you want a certain level of objectivity, right? Everyone who's ever weighed risk, that's just a given, right? You want a certain level of objectivity. That's why they don't let you decide whether you should qualify for your own mortgage, right? Because you wouldn't be objective about it, right? Obviously. It can make you very overconfident in the understanding of your user, right? So you lose that objectivity, and it can make you feel like you know your user better than you do, and that could prevent you from doing the research that you need to do to prevent you from making a really big mistake. So I think that's the one thing. I think you nailed the second one, right? Kind of danger is that you substitute empathy for research. So you get people in a room, and because you've built this deep understanding of the user, you believe that in any context, in any situation, you can predict what they're going to want and what they're going to need. Disclaimer, sometimes we do this, right? The feature is small, the value's big, the risk is little, and we do it, right? We make a guess, and we go out and we live with it, right? That's a given. We're not talking about that, right? We're not talking about, adding a form field to the checkout, right? We're not something that simple. We're talking about bigger things, right? We're talking about adding a new product, adding a whole new feature, all of those things. That's where I think your danger comes in, right? When you believe that you can speak for the user. I think the other thing is, this was an interesting parallel that somebody that actually worked for me gave me, is that, and they were a big sailor, they said that experience decisions are additive, and they're much like, oh, I see also Debbie now, Debbie and also Debbie, that experience decisions are additive. They're like setting a course on a boat. Every decision you make adds upon the other. So every time you make an intuitive or an empathic decision, right, without doing research, you risk it being wrong. And even if it's small, you risk it's wrong. And then if you make another decision based on that intuition or empathic, empathic sense without doing research, you risk that being wrong. And so by the time you do research, you could be pretty far off course if you're not careful, right? Again, can't say do or don't do the thing, right? Because it's about risk management. You have to weigh that risk and decide how much risk is it that if we're wrong, that we're going to be way off course. The caveat is sometimes we do make decisions in a boat to go around the storm, right? And we know that we're going off course. We make that decision on purpose, and we know the risks, and we know what we need to do to get back on course afterwards, right? That happens in product all the time, right? Oh, we have a technical constraint. That's my favorite one. Oh, we have a technical constraint. Oh, crap. That API is not going to be ready for 6 more months, but this feature's got a lot of value. Let's launch it with the less robust API with a slimmer experience, knowing that we're going to come back and correct it, but we're going to veer off course a little bit here. And this experience might not be ideal, but it's probably okay, good enough, and we're just going to go with it, right? Even though our research over here said, we researched the full-on solution. Okay, we're going to go with this for now.
I think it's an important point to remind people that empathy might accidentally bring in bias, because you're feeling like, well, I get our customers, I know our customers, I'm seeing through their eyes. If you haven't really done that because of knowledge, if it's because of guessing, then you could be getting into trouble and you could be creating bias for yourself. So I think we have to remind people to keep looking out for their own biases.
Yeah, one of the things that I see as a real risk with this sort of empathic design is the idea that I might focus on the symptom rather than the solution, right? That I might focus on solving the symptom rather than the root problem. And we as UX people have to be grounded in root problem solving, right? Even if we get shouted down, even if we have to go back and just solve the symptom, our thoughts should always go to, how do we solve that root problem? What is that root problem? So, it may be that, they can't find this product on the floor. Well, the root problem might be that there's 4 bajillion products being presented to me visually all the time in every aisle, and I can't distinguish it. And so, what I'll do is I'll go and maybe I'll make the packaging more of that product. But if I'm the retailer and all my products are that distinct, I'm just staggering the problem to different products, right? The root problem is it's visually too complex, and I need to slim that down, right? But it can get us focused on the wrong things. I think that's also very troublesome idea. I'll use a personal example. We were working on an internal world tool. This is going to be something that's going to be a case study on my site, actually. And the UX team had taken several passes at the symptom, which was they were frustrated at how long it actually took to enter orders. So what we did is we did some observation, right? So we observed some of their order entry folks, a couple hours for the day, watched all that video, and discovered that the real problem was that they had to go to 3 different websites to look up all this product information. And so it wasn't even the tool itself that was the big bulk of time. We found that was okay, right? But none of the user interviews surfaced that, because they all thought of it as one process. And even when they were asked questions in the past specific to that, they didn't process it because it wasn't part of the order entry tool. But the previous efforts were so focused on the symptom, that the frustration of the user, that they misapplied that sympathy. They misapplied that empathy for their user.
And it sounds like they should have done more of a task analysis to really see that end-to-end experience and any additional workarounds.
Exactly, right. They should have gone deeper and really observed the users, right? That's really the key thing that unlocked the box, was we actually watched the users And we could see that, when the folks in the Philippines were on dial-up, the order entry folks in the Philippines who were on dial-up were pulling up e-commerce pages with big, heavy images that it was taking forever, right? And they had 3 of these and then a wiki that they had to go to. So this was the root problem, and we figured it out and solved it. But the previous efforts, while good and solid and did good things to the interface, they didn't really discover what that root problem was, because they were focused on solving the user's frustration versus actually trying to discover the root cause.
Yeah, and speaking of root problem, I've learned that the reason why my camera and microphone died is because I loaded in cool new effects. And thanks to my cool new effects, I killed my microphone and camera. So I'm going to need to fix that system. Hooray for diagnosing root causes. But hey,
there you go.
Effects. So let's also refocus on what we can do differently, unless there were a couple of other dangers you wanted to get to.
No, I think those are, of course there's other dangers, there's other pros, there's other cons, but I think those are the big ones that when I think about, kind of that current definition of empathic design, I think where the dangers are. And I really, I don't want to say don't use empathy, but at the same time, I think with any tool or concept, we need to understand what the risks are. What are those risks? What are those problems that we might run into, so we can adjust, because we know there's bias in the process. No matter how great we try to be, we know that we have our own biases. We know that the team has biases. We know that stakeholders have biases. We know that industries have biases, right? We know that all of that exists. And it's our job to adjust as much as we can for those. And I think when we're using empathy or trying to use empathy as a tool or motivation or a fuel, we have to understand kind of the dangers of that process, right? That said, there are folks
that's a great point to make sure that empathy and pseudo-empathy are not biases or crutches.
Right, exactly. And I'm not going to say that there aren't companies that aren't using empathy in a definition that would not require you to get into the minds of those individuals, right? There are people that are using design thinking in a way that I think human-centered designers, that it's human-centered field. It's based on research. It's based on that. There are people doing that in the world. I don't want to say that everyone's doing it badly or everybody's doing it wrong. I think there are companies that are really doing it well, but I think there are a lot of risks in that you have to understand when you start to engage that I want to understand my users' feels. I want to feel what they feel, right? I think there's a lot of things to that.
And we also saw a famous guy who I won't name coming out and saying, like, well, we don't have to interface with users too much. We just have to feel what they feel. And that came off very woo-woo and kind of arrogant.
That's great, but that's really risky, right? If you want to talk about raising the risk of the wrong things, let's do a live experiment, right? So I want to use this example of, Apollo 13. Not Apollo project, not just Apollo 13, but the Apollo project in general. How much testing did they do? They tested all those components, all those different scenarios, and they did that. But they didn't just build the Apollo rockets, put it on the launch thing, and say, let's go. But when you say stuff like, we don't need to talk to users, you're doing that. You're building the rocket ship, and you're putting it into space. Now, that's a really extreme example, because obviously the Apollo project was really expensive, and you're risking the lives of crew, etc. And it's not easy to just iterate, right? Because it's really expensive. It takes a long time to build a rocket. So there may be things where you can afford to take that level of risk. But if you're building a brand new product within an established company that's going to go out to, you don't want that to just roll out to your whole fleet of stores or your whole e-commerce experience without testing it, right? If it's a critical piece or a really important piece, especially if you're talking about it to your stockholders and your board. I can't tell you how many times that's happened where we've gone to the board, somebody's gone to the board with something and we're like, we haven't tested that. Okay.
Yeah. We just saw Boeing do that with the Starliner, where they said, well, testing would have taken 25 hours, so we just tested a bunch of small pieces, but never the whole process together. And then, of course, it ended up being a giant failure, and that's Boeing.
Right. You could do it if you want, but I'm going to be the guy in the back of the room going, hey, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We probably need to think about that. Can we stop? Can we whiteboard that? Like, what are the risks here? Let's do a pros and cons of the risk. can we whiteboard that? I mean, just pause for a minute. I mean, that's usually, I mean, if anybody who knows me, like, I'll say whiteboard instead of put a pin in it. I'll be like, can we whiteboard that? Can we just talk about that for a minute? Can we just discuss that? Like, whiteboard is my trigger word for group discussion. Let's have a conversation about it, right? It's kind of my soft word, not safe word, soft word.
Safe word.
Very important. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it kind of is. It's like a release out. Like, hey, let's talk about that. Let's whiteboard that out, and let's really have a conversation about what we're talking about here and what the real risks are. So, when we talk about what can we do instead, I mean, I think, again, empathy could be a great fuel. Sympathy can be a great fuel. Compassion can be a great fuel. They can really motivate you and push you to think about and do things in a way, and maybe research things in an edge case that you've never done before. I think, somebody who's willing to go undercover as a homeless person probably has a great deal of sympathy or compassion for the people in that plight, because that's a pretty significant personal risk. Right. So I think there's that element of it that I can't say is bad. I think you just have to understand the risks. But I think once you go through that experience, I think my process has always been to work from uncertainty to relative certainty. Right. So I always start from a clean mental whiteboard. It's not efficient for us to work from scratch on everything. So we can't grow the corn and make the mill the flour and then make, the corn bread, right? We can't do that. It's not practical. We have a lot of research potentially in our company, and we have a lot of external research. Like if you're in e-commerce, Baymart's a great place to start, right? Get all that information, and then you can begin to go through and add those to and write those down on your whiteboard, right? Or put them in Miro, or whatever you do. Just write down those facts, those ideas, and then figure out how you might posit those for your user, right? So maybe you have to do an interview to posit that. Maybe you don't. Maybe you can just go look at your user data on your website and say, hey, my users use it like this. So, okay, maybe that's even up. Maybe I can look at that. But you should consciously apply each fact, right? You shouldn't just take everything you think you know about your user kind of ad nauseum, right? That's not effective, right? You should take each of those facts in for each project that you work on as you go along. Now, that sounds like a lot of overhead, but this could be a quick mental process, right? For a lot of small things, this goes really quick, right? It's bing, 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 right? And you can use those. I don't have any patent on bing, bing, bing. So if somebody wants to use those in their thought process, bing, 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 and when they're doing it out loud, I won't charge you a dime. But, go through those. But that also includes your preconceptions and your feelings, right? You need to write those down, and you need to validate whether that's true or not, right? I may have a great deal of compassion for this user. I may need to check that at some point within this process, that I can maintain that level of objectivity to make good decisions on my user, right? I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. Again, this is all it depends, right? You really have to evaluate all of that. And I think back to another conversation that we've had a bunch of times, and you've had on your podcast, is junior UXers, right? That's why it's so hard for junior UXers to jump in and take on high-level roles, because it's really tough, right? This stuff isn't checklist, right? You can't just checklist. Right. It really requires a little discernment to understand, how can I pull back? How can I check that particular part of what I'm feeling and still make a good decision? Again, and that's really that's a maturity thing in terms of your practice.
And very quickly, I'm going to stick something over your face, but just a reminder to people, see episode 56 about phases of proficiency. That will also detail some of the things that David was just saying, that you can't just use UX at the building blocks level. You've got to be using science, technique, depth, and quality.
I think the second thing is really observation, right? I think a lot of people in UX research and UX forget that we invented all these things because we couldn't watch the user, right? The product didn't exist, or it's not possible to watch the user. Like, you really can't observe a user who's working on a system that's highly classified unless you've got high-level security clearance, right? There's lots of things you're not going to be able to observe. And so we've invented all these techniques to intervene, but there is nothing like observation, right? Nothing like observation. Every time I engage the observational research method, I get so much more than I ever asked for, right? I get so much information that I can't even process it all the time, right? I'm getting and I'm not just getting information about the project I'm working on, I'm suddenly distracted by all these other problems that we could solve too, right? I worked on a retail associate app at one of my stops, and I went into the stores and I just watched. They probably thought I was creepy, and they probably called security on me a couple of times, and I didn't know about it, and there was security watching or something outside, and I wasn't even aware. But I just watched what they were doing, and the way they transitioned and the way they were interrupted. Totally flipped my mental model of what needed to happen for this retail associate app that they were in and what their problems were. Again, one of the apps we were working on was a very specific function, but what we found out, it was the process that they were using. Yeah, it was a little manual, but the real problem was interruptions. While they were doing that process, they were being interrupted by customers 100 times. That's a positive interruption. That's an interruption you want to happen. You don't want to isolate your associates from customers. That's not right. But how do I go back? They were spending so much time going back to that task, even more so than the task itself, right? And so that was a problem that we set out to solve. How do I stop in the middle of what I'm doing, help this customer, and then come right back to where I'm at, right? Big win right there, right? So that's
more task analysis and more understanding of the user's real or the customer, or in your case, an internal customer's real experience, rather than guessing it or assuming it, or I'm thinking about the user.
They were frustrated because they said we can't find the product on the spreadsheet. What they really meant that they were using originally, right? Before we're building the app out. The real thing was they couldn't find out where they left off. So they couldn't go back easily to the product, and that's what they meant. But a user interview doesn't always turn that up, right? But in the observation, in the context, it was easy to spot right away what the problem was, right? I saw people looking back at their spreadsheet trying to figure out where they left off, and they spent 10 minutes going back to the back, figuring out what they had pulled, what they hadn't pulled, right? Really a lot of time to do something that an app could fix really simply. But then we took that idea and we spread that across the whole ecosystem in terms of how we were thinking and strategizing around that concept, right? That interruption was, when I'm on the floor, is a key thing, and how do I go back to my task in an interrupted fashion so I'm maximizing my time on task. And I think the last thing is something that I keep meaning to post on LinkedIn, but I'm really afraid of the fire and the pitchforks, because there are so many people that love, certain prototyping tools that aren't really protyping tools, and we've kind of talked about this before, Debbie. And
yes, we have. Go ahead, say it out loud here. We can be controversial here.
Yeah, I mean, it's really to test instead of review, and I see this a lot, even with senior UX researchers and senior UX designers, where they're walking users through their designs. That's not testing your design. That's reviewing.
Show and tell.
Yeah, that's show and tell. If the user's not driving, you're not testing, right? That's a key thing for me. That's one of my key rules of thumb. My other one is, if you're talking more than 30% of the time, it was an interview, not a test, right? Your user should be telling you what they're doing, and they should be narrating, right? Like, tell me what the best technique I've ever seen and that I've adopted personally was, walk through this, tell me what you're thinking as you do things. And just having them narrate, now it slows them down, so you can't measure time on task through that, because they're engaging different parts of their brain. They're trying to process their verbal and visual and task-based things. Their brain is hopping all over the place. Cognitive load goes through the roof. But when they're going through it, you're getting a good read on what they're thinking, what they're feeling. I'm really confused here. Okay, now I can step in and help you, or I can say, you try to figure it out. Figure it out. Let me see where you make that next abstract cognitive leap to the thing that we didn't do well. Let me see. Okay, now I see where you went, where you would go, and if I see 5 users make that same intuitive cognitive leap, that helps guide me to where I might put it next, right? So again, that's another thing, and I think it's really about making sure you have a tool or an ecosystem, right? Like, if you can spin up code to test prototypes fast, that's no problem. Like, you can continue to use kind of a click-through, screen reviewer, right? That's fine for your kind of early stage stuff. If you've got a dedicated team that's building out you full code prototypes, right? A luxury that few of us ever have, right? I mean, I've never had that. I would love that. I mean, if somebody wants to give me a job where I have that, that would be awesome.
And not usually the best use of engineering's time or our time.
No, right. Like, and usually, yeah, exactly. And it's one thing if you've got engineers who can leverage the production code stack to deliver that work, but if they're spinning up, kind of one-off HTML, CSS, JS prototypes one off at a time, even if they're building from a framework, that's kind of throwaway work. And we really want to look at what we were doing. There are tools in the marketplace, Azure, Figma, UX Pen that do a high level of functional and a high level of design fidelity. It's a map, right? It's a grid, not they're all in the same, do the exact same things well. But looking at those where you can design and build a prototype that's testable, I like to hand things off to engineering that are testing, because they really hate when I come back and say, hey guys, that doesn't work, we need to rebuild that. That gets me a lot of quiet, awkward stares at the stand-ups in the morning, which is why I love virtual stand-ups, by the way, because then I don't see those cold, icy stares that happen. It's fantastic. So those are the kind of things I just turn. I don't look at the screen while I say it. I kind of like look over here, and I'm like, so guys, we got to rebuild that because when we tested it, it went badly. So I don't have to look at them exactly. I kind of like look away, so I don't have to make eye contact. So I think those are the three things that off the top of my head, or that I think that I do that try to adjust for those kind of personal things. I think really really trying to start with a clean mental whiteboard. I think is just try to check everything that you think at the door. And to me, that's part of being humble, right? I don't always come off as a humble person, but I think my process tries to keep me honest, right? I try to build that into my process, knowing that I can be pretty sure of myself and I can get hooked on an idea really easy. Again, personal bias, right? I have kind of a catch in my process from my own personal bias, and that's really starting off with a clean mental whiteboard. Maybe not everybody has that. Maybe that's just me. Maybe that's a me problem and not an everybody else problem. But I think it's a helpful exercise, and something that as I'm mentoring junior designers, like, let's really start at the beginning of this thing. Let's really strip it down to what do we think we know?
Right.
Do we really know it? And then what do we need to know, right? What do we need to learn? Yeah. And then observation.
I wish I saw more of that in the junior portfolios. I feel like a lot of junior portfolios, they've learned somewhere to come up with a hypothesis, but then I feel like they spend a lot of time trying to prove the hypothesis true, and they didn't learn. Yeah. Go ahead.
Like the same problem as a design challenge, right? I'm given this limited context, and I need to complete this design. And so I have to make some assumptions along the way, right, to do it. And I think junior UXers in portfolios and boot camps, as much as they try to give you more context, right? When I was teaching way back in the day, just web design, I got my students, each got a real project, a real client that they work with. And they were usually some nonprofit who couldn't afford a website. And these were really simple projects. But putting that student in an actual project forced them, they couldn't make assumptions. They had to ask the questions. And even though that wasn't UX way back then, that's not what I was teaching, I think that is invaluable, right? And I think that's why unfortunately, we're seeing entry-level jobs with 2 to 3 years of experience, because if you don't have that experience, it's really hard to do UX. Like, it's really, really hard to have that unless you've got a mentor, or you've got a boss, or a lead, or somebody who's taking 20% of their productivity for 2 years to invest in you. And that's, in my experience, what it really takes to
very
grow
rare.
Somebody from,
it's needed, but rare.
To a solo, right, to a mid, where they can operate on the project on their own, right? It is rare, right? There's just not a lot of companies. Again, and this gets back to that discussion of UX as a function, UX as a practice, right? Where we see a lot of companies building out UX as a function to do things, but not a whole ton of them. There's some of them, but not a majority of them that are actually thinking about building out a practice, even if they have multiple practitioners on their team. So I think that's all kind of part and parcel to that as well.
And unfortunately, some of them have thought, well, we should build out a practice, but it should be a design thinking practice.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that at some companies. I'm seeing titles changing. I'm seeing department names changing, and people are now head of design thinking, and everybody, I guess everyone's doing design thinking practitioner.
And that's nothing against nothing against those individuals, right? I think that you can have a title and do a different job, right? And I think that's part of it. I do believe that there is a there is a gap in what we call design thinking. I think we've talked about that before. I think part of it is empathy and what that really means. I do think that that's a thing that's out there. I think that, I think what's really interesting is that the audience for design thinking was not designers. I don't think it was
Exactly.
ever
I keep saying that. I'm not the target audience for design thinking. I already do this on a much higher level.
When you go through and you actually read through what IDEO presents, right? Who kind of, Stanford School of Design sort of through this thing out in the world, it's targeted at business and product teams and technology stakeholders for them to understand, right? Well, to get the buy-in, but also to get them to think, to move UX, move that user or customer research, right? Whatever you want to call it, up higher in the chain, right? So that maturity level from, I think it's an attempt to get companies to go from maturity level 1, which is usability and accessibility, right? That's kind of what I call maturity level 1, to maturity level 2 and 3, where you're pulling it up and you're having UX answer questions about usefulness and desirability, right? So imagine a process where you can figure out whether your customers care about something before you spend $200,000 or $250,000 to launch a pilot program, right? Imagine that, right? Imagine the value that could have. And design thinking, right? When you think about like that, just the simple process of the ideation and the prototyping and keeping it small, and then you could do it. And I think the same thing applies to design sprints as well, right? When we talk about those, right? They're really design experiments. And I don't know about you, but I've been doing them for years, right? I didn't call them a design sprint because a sprint's a sprint and that's agile, and I try not to steal their words because then they start to steal mine.
I don't call it a design sprint because I don't get a whole bunch of people in a room and treat it as a craft project.
Right. And like I said, I don't try to steal agile words because then they try to steal mine and that usually goes bad, right? Because the words don't mean the same. Don't steal my words, I won't steal yours, right? We were running design experiments, but there was a very tight focus on those design experiments, right? We would run those kind of tests and experiments in very little bubbles to see what kind of response. Sometimes we were just trying to figure out how would maybe a person respond to this, right? And I think the example in the Design Sprints book is kind of maybe a good use case for what this design sprint problem solving process does, right? We're trying to see how a few people, we don't care how many people, just a few, are they going to run screaming from the robot and jump out the window? Or are they going to call security on the robot when the robot shows up? We don't know. And we're just trying to discover that part of it. How do we make that part of the experience not freak people out? And so if you confine it to a small problem that your methodology can solve, I think that's fine. But thinking that you're going to use design sprints for everything, it's just like thinking that you only need a screwdriver to drive. That you can use a screwdriver to drive a nail, right? You can. It's going to hurt, and you're going to use it upside down, and you're not going to like it, and it's probably going to bend the nail. But you could do it, right? It's a possible thing. It's just not. The results are going to be suboptimal, right? So those are the sorts of things that as we talk about, and that's where I think empathic design kind of. I don't want to say frightens me, but kind of, gives me a little bit of alarm, is that we're trying to substitute something for actually interacting with the users. And I think some people will say, well, we're doing it right because we're not. Great. I think that's fine. You're using the word empathy. You're equating that with understanding. I think there's danger in redefining words. I've always thought that, but that's a natural progression of language. We redefine words over time. It's unfortunate but true. The pace has increased, and since I was a kid, updates to the dictionary were very rare. Right now, they're happening with more frequency because we transact text way more back than when I was. I mean, we used to write letters, right, like to each other. Or talk on the phone. We didn't have fancy machines that we could send text messages to each other or write blog posts that live forever online, right? We didn't have that. So I think there's a little bit of that too, where empathy is starting to mean something different, but I think it's also important to understand the risks that are involved with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've only got a few minutes left. I'm sorry we didn't get any questions in the chat room today. We do have a handful of people watching live. Thanks to people watching live. And of course, special thanks to everybody for putting up with my technical difficulties, though I did all of a sudden realize I could call in as one of my own guests. And so that ended up being a better solution than trying to get my equipment to come back online. So thanks to everybody for your patience with me and my technical failures today. David, we only have a few minutes left. Let people know where they can find you, follow you, connect with you, and give us some last words on improving how we approach our design.
Yeah, so the best place to connect with me is always on LinkedIn. I just don't have the bandwidth to keep up with more channels than that. You'll find that I'm pretty quiet on LinkedIn. I don't post very much. I'm trying to change that, but you know, I have a little bit of imposter syndrome, and whether these things that I'm saying are of value to people or they've already figured them out, I think to me that's always something that that I struggle with, and so I don't post very often there. I'm snarky, in case you didn't figure it out. So sometimes if I reply, I have to, reread my stuff about 7 times, which just increases the friction.
Emojis.
Like LinkedIn has a great way to submit comments, except that David has to filter for snark, and it's unintentional snark, and sometimes it's just me trying to be funny and conversational, but I do have to filter that out. So it takes me 7 times as long as I say as other people to post on LinkedIn, because reply on LinkedIn because of that. So LinkedIn, it's linkedin.com/in/super creative.
Super creative.
And that's super creative. Yeah, that was my business name a long time ago, and I kept it because it's easy to remember.
That is, and most people can spell that, so thank you. So I guess we will wind down for today. Sorry again about my technical issues, but thanks so much for joining us on this really cool topic and a lot of great angles. And everybody, mind your empathy. It might not be what you think it is. And David, I hope we'll have you back and come up with another topic, and I promise I will have fine-tuned my system for that.
Anytime, glad to do it.
Yes, thanks again, and now I'm going to play us out of here. Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thanks for watching. Delta CX is available for consulting and projects related to CX and UX strategy, leadership, training, problem finding, problem solving, and innovation. Learn more at deltacx.com.